down for DARPA, which has its own source of funding. I'm sure some of it subterranean black budget type funding. DARPA representatives have said very diplomatically, we have our other sources that are independent of formal US government funds, and I'm sure they do. I'm sure DARPA does. One of the things that the government shutdown will not affect is DARPA research into creating a Terminator type of scenario, just like a friendly Terminator kind of thing to make our lives much more pleasant. I want to show you a couple of the things that they're working on, and there's a reason I want to do this. This is a clip of something that they call the cheetah. And if you can see this, there's supposed to be sound here, if you can get that going. This thing gets up to about 28, 29 miles per hour. Don't think you can outrun it. You can't. It's pretty impressive. And if that doesn't frighten you enough, then take a look at this fellow. He's coming to get you. Pretty nifty. They have things that we really don't have. And I want to show you one other thing. This is a clip now, about 6 million people have seen this on YouTube, and it comes from apparently Iraqi insurgents. I think this looks real. I mean, people are debating it right now, but it concerns the kind of a version of the Harry Potter invisibility cloak, an invisibility suit. And you're going to see this. These are US vehicles that have arrived on the scene. And you're going to see something very interesting. So watch it carefully. You're going to see, here he comes. You're going to see it again. I'll show it one more time. And that was released, I think, in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. And officially, of course, well, we don't have anything supposedly like that, but I think maybe we do. The idea of an invisibility suit, this is actually not science fiction. It involves bending light around, the object in question. Typically, we thought that it could work for small objects, but I think the US military may have mastered something even a little bit better than that. You'll notice that the figure was much more difficult to see in the kind of natural area over there and was more visible as he approached the tank. So evidently it was a camouflage type of a suit that worked for a certain type of environment. Again, just to show that there is a great divide. And the great divide is between the classified world and us. They have things that we don't have, and we might wonder what else do they have, and I want to talk about that. This is how we're going to take our little segue into UFOs. UFO phenomenon, contrary to what most of us schooled in the conventional wisdom of our world, is actually one of the absolutely most fascinating and also relevant topics in our world today. Why? Because when you really study this, you find that it affects pretty much every single factor of importance in our world today. It certainly has a tremendous amount of influence and importance in the world of energy, technology, our black budget world, which has taken over much of our formal system, our old-fashioned republic, sort of like a new type of clothing or armor that's gone around it and has really become the dominant modality in many ways. And UFO phenomenon is important for social and I would say existential implications. I think we can get into all of those and then come back into breakthrough energy, which is really going to be the main topic of my talk here. But let's talk about a little bit about UFO and UFO secrecy. If you go back 60 years and pretend that you're Harry Truman and you've been presented with some information, and that information has to do with the fact that this phenomenon seems to be real. There are others, there's other technology, other beings perhaps, that are interacting with us in our world. maybe something that we recovered at Roswell or another crash retrieval site involving exotic technology. You think it may not be true? Well, let's think again. On top of that, the president would have been informed or would have learned that we've had essentially what I would say are non-stop military encounters with objects that are unconventional, that don't look like anything that we've created, and that have incredible performance characteristics. And not just militaries, and not just the United States military, but other militaries around the world. And of course, non-stop sightings by ordinary people around the world. On top of that, oh, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I would recommend, if you are interested in following up on this, I wrote an article a few years ago that I still think is quite useful, particularly for people who really know nothing about the UFO phenomenon and think, well, what's, really is this, what's the evidence? Well, there's a lot of interesting government documents, I'll talk a little bit about these, that do take UFOs quite seriously. I would say individually, the officially released documents that we've gotten through Freedom of Information don't prove that UFOs are alien or ET. I would say that collectively they make a very strong case that what we are dealing with is not supposed to exist, but yet it does. And that high-level government officials have been taking it seriously since the very beginning. You can read that article at my website, richarddolanpress.com. One of the documents, and this is not one that I wrote about in that article, but nonetheless is quite significant, interesting. It's interesting because it shows performance characteristics that are amazing. This is from Guam, 1947. I'll just read the relevant part to you. It's an Army intelligence document. Flying objects in Guam. Unidentified flying objects have been observed by 3 American enlisted men of the 147th Airway and Air Communication Service Squadron at Harmon Field in Guam. The men report that at 10:40 hours, that's in the morning, on August 14th, the 2 objects, which they describe as small, crescent-shaped and traveling at a speed twice that of a fighter plane, passed over them on a zigzag course in a westerly direction at an approximate altitude of 1,200 feet, not that high up at all. The objects disappeared into clouds. And a few seconds later, a similar object, possibly one of these previously observed, emerged from the clouds and proceeded west. No further details have been reported. Very interesting. Very fast, zigzagging. What can zigzag? We have a much better known memo, at least among researchers of UFO, called the Twining Memo. Nathan Twining was a 3-star general at the time. He later became a 4-star general and head of U.S. Air Force. And in response to a query by another general in September of 1947, who wanted to know what is the significance of these flying saucers, is this anything that we have to deal with, Twining wrote back a 3-page memo. It was secret at the time. And he says these objects are real, they are not visionary or fictitious. Interesting, particularly since in 1947, the official word was that these were hallucinations or natural phenomenon or what have you, but not real things. Twining is saying otherwise. He describes some of their performance, which again is off the charts, really great. Extreme rates of climb and maneuverability, evasive action, metallic light reflecting surface, absence of trail, and my favorite, circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom, and domed on top. I'd like to know what in 1947 would look like that. No sound, and so forth. Very interesting memo. An FBI memo just from a couple of years later, which again emphasizes that this is a serious thing here. That the matter is considered top secret by intelligence officers of the U.S. military, and then describing a large number of violations of very sensitive airspace by objects, again, that just were not supposed to exist over nuclear installations and sensitive Air Force and military installations. It's a very long memo. It's very interesting to read. Another memo from 1950 describing, yet again, more violations of airspace by objects, in this case, round in form, being seen over the Hanford Atomic Energy Commission plant. This is fascinating. Air Force jets attempted interception with negative results. All units, including the Anti-Aircraft Battalion, radar units, Air Force fighter squadrons, and the FBI were alerted for further observation. The Atomic Energy Commission states that the investigation is continuing. Of course, we have no record of what they concluded and how that investigation did continue. But again, this is quite interesting. Can you imagine if in 1950 President Truman had admitted that, well, yes, in fact, there's this thing going on over Hanford, and we've tried sending our Air Force squadron fighters after them, and, well, we haven't succeeded, but don't worry, we're working on the problem. It'd be a very difficult thing to deal with. But all in the classified world, see, they were having these conversations. Another fascinating encounter, again showing extraordinary performance. This is in Georgia, near an Air Force base. A pilot, a very experienced World War II pilot, had an encounter in the air which he described. An object, he says, flat on top and bottom, appearing from a front view to be rounded and slightly beveled. The object from the front dived at him below his aircraft. And as it dove in front of him, it was spinning, he said. Pure white, no trail, tremendous speed. And here's this really fascinating part. He described he felt a bump in the plane when it went underneath him. So maybe the air pressure just hit his plane in a certain way. Highly reliable pilot. One of my favorite, and I think one of the most important memos that we have from the early period of the UFO cover-up, what we call the Chadwell memo. And H. Marshall Chadwell was head of scientific intelligence for the CIA at this particular time. And he's writing in this memo to his boss, the director of the CIA, Walter Bedell Smith. Smith, by the way, had been Eisenhower's chief of staff during D-Day. So now he's head of CIA, and he gets this memo, and what does Chadwell say? Well, he's saying this is pretty serious business. At this time, he says, the reports of incidents convince us that there is something going on which must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. How much more obvious do you want to make it? Something was going on, and it wasn't anything that we were making or anything we thought the Russians were making, and it wasn't natural. So you fill in the blank yourself. And it just keeps going. I don't have too many more of these to show you. This is just an introduction for the newbies. Oak Ridge nuclear facility in Tennessee had a long history of documented violations of sensitive airspace there in the late 1940s going into the 50s. This is one from 1953. Again, a fascinating account. States here, object was extremely black in color, having an appearance of a deep black metal exterior with a fine gloss. It did not leave a vapor trail. No sound was heard. Again, we see this pattern. What can do this? The object flew east at a tremendous speed for what appeared to be 3 miles, where it stopped. The object was then joined by 2 more of these same objects. A formation similar to a spread V was formed, and the objects, at a tremendous speed, flew in an eastward direction. Again, you just wonder, what would it have been like had these reports been public at the time? Particularly America in the 1950s, where there was a little more of a semblance of a free press, somewhat, right? Where Americans actually believed that they had a government that was responsive to them, where Americans actually were not afraid to speak up a little bit more about being a free citizen in a Republican set of Republican institution. I think they would have been very interested to know about these. But of course, this was not known for many years. On top of the many myriad sightings and encounters that military personnel in this country and other countries had with these unknown objects, there's more. There's more. And the more is that there are leaks. Now, they're not the same as officially sanctioned documents out of the National Archives. Nonetheless, these are very good leaks, very interesting, from high-level people with a lot of credibility who speak about what? Alien technology and bodies in deeply compartmented parts of our national security apparatus. One of these that I have listed here was a researcher, that was Leonard Stringfield. He, in the late 1970s and through the 80s, collected scores really, of fascinating and I think very credible accounts from individuals about alien bodies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or recovery of exotic materials and so on. Quite a few of these. Stringfield spoke to one surgeon who had told him in some detail about an autopsy on a non-human alien being that he had performed. Very, very interesting, and there's a lot you can follow up on regarding that. These other individuals, from Senator Barry Goldwater, Dr. Robert Saubacher, Eric Walker, Ben Rich, Edgar Mitchell, all of these people, and a number of others, have had fairly detailed accounts about their own interaction with this type of a reality. And again, there's just so much to go into, but what I discovered, see, I've been in this field now about 20 years. I started out very conservatively back then. Back then, I just wanted to know if there's a historical reason to think that this was important. I didn't want to know if UFOs even were real. I didn't care at the time. I guess I care now, but at the time, I just wanted to know, was this something that mattered? Well, it turns out it sure is, and has never stopped being something that mattered. So the more you look, the more you find. Now, think about it. If you've recovered ET technology, let's say, you're not going to sit on your thumbs for 60 years looking at it. You're going to want to study it. You want to analyze it. You want to try to replicate it and understand it. James Goodall was a journalist for a number of years with some very prominent aerospace and aviation publications. He was not a UFO guy. He was an aviation aerospace guy. But he did spent a lot of time at Groom Lake, or talking to people who worked at Groom Lake, I should say, in very deep black programs. Cultivated a number of fascinating people. There's some video clips of Goodall out there. I'm sure you can find them. What he found, this is in the 1980s, before the world even knew of a fellow named Bob Lazar. James Goodall spoke to Groom Lake insiders. One of them, he said, "So are UFOs real?" The guy said, "Absolutely, positively, they are real." He went on to say that we have things in the Nevada desert that would make George Lucas envious. Pretty interesting. Another source, this is 1985 or 1986, a long time ago, said, "We have things out there that are literally out of this world." Literally out of this world. That's what, 27, 28 years ago. Okay. Said better than Star Trek or anything you can see in the movies. Now you can say this is just talk, and I suppose that's really what it is. But there's a lot of this type of talk. And what I would say is that it may not count the same as, again, a document out of the archives, but I think a reasonable mind, looking at enough of these, is going to start making some reasonable conclusions that would include the fact that this seems to be real. This seems to be real. I think this is an interesting photograph. I think it's an important one. It's from Provo, Utah, not far from Dugway Proving Ground. It was taken in 1966 by a pilot who captured this object. And this was analyzed, actually, by the Condon Committee, which was commissioned by the University of Colorado back in the late 1960s to do a scientific study of UFOs in general. Now, I think the Condon Committee was a rigged game from the beginning, and I'm certainly not alone in that conclusion. The Condon Committee looked at this and said, well, you really can't tell anything. It could have been something thrown up in the air. But you have the testimony of a pilot who had some very specific things to say about it, and I think it's fair to say that most researchers who've studied this think that this is a legitimate photograph. On top of that, you have the story of the ARV. What's the ARV? That's the Alien Reproduction Vehicle. Again, in the UFO research community, it's a fairly well-known story. And I'm just going to give you the short version, the thumbnail version. At an air show at Lockheed in 1988, November, an aviation executive named Brad Sorensen was accompanied by a senior defense official. It is speculated that this gentleman might have been Frank Carlucci. High-level person. They go in. The high-level person says to Sorensen, this looks like a little more high-level than I had expected, so just don't say anything, and we'll be cool. They go in, and what Sorensen saw, and this is a drawing, by the way, by Mark McCandlish, an aerospace aviation illustrator, and a friend of Sorensen. Sorensen goes in behind a divider in this large hangar, called the Big Hangar, sees three, objects that look like this, flying saucers, hovering silently. He said, I looked for cables and ropes, there were nothing. They were just hovering. He said there was a 4-star general at a podium talking about them, calling them the ARV, Alien Reproduction Vehicle, and saying that they had traversed the solar system. That sounds pretty out there. But Sorensen looked at these things and he said they looked like they'd been around the block a little bit. They looked like they'd been worn and they'd been worked. He gave a very, very meticulous description to his friend McCandlish, who then drew this object. We have also something that I think also shows that we're making something like this. And this is leaked footage, legitimate footage out of Nellis testing range. It was leaked to hard copy in early 1995. This video is from 1994, and again, you can find this on YouTube. It's about 2 or so minutes long, and it's quite fascinating. You hear the voices of 2 Air Force personnel who are recording it. That's their job. They're at the test ground. And they're saying things like, what is that? Is that a helicopter? That can't be a helicopter. Well, no, it's not a helicopter. There have been a number of analyses of this that have shown the maneuverability of this is off the charts. Really cool. It, within 2 minutes' time, went from a speed of 15 miles per hour to roughly 500 miles per hour, including a right-angle turn at about 140 miles per hour. Pretty nifty. I would guess that that's something that we're making. Can't really get confirmation from any government source, of course, but that's what it sure looks like. Also looked like it might even be shape-shifting to some extent. It's hard to tell. The video is interesting, and I would encourage you to look at it. So what I would say is that we seem to have some version of a flying saucer technology. That's what it looks like to me. Does that mean that all flying saucers are ours? Well, I wouldn't say that, but I think that maybe some of these objects, who knows how many, are probably objects that we, I say we loosely because I'm not part of that whole community, are making. So the lesson is, someone's flying something that's not supposed to exist but does exist. Something with extraordinary performance capabilities and presumably an unusual source of energy. It's not gasoline. Something else, something better. We're working on it in secret, so we can say that. Let's go back to the reasons for secrecy. Why would there be secrecy? Maybe it seems like a grade school type of question, but let's explore it a little bit. One thing, let's go back in time to the late 1940s again. And I think it's fair to say that this phenomenon, if you're the president again, and you're presented with this extraordinary development, would you want to tell the world about it? Well, there might be part of you that thinks the world has a right to know, but there'd be a bigger part of you, I think, that would say, not yet. Not yet. Why? Well, it's just too revolutionary. The post-World War II world was a world lying flat on its back in exhaustion, with millions of people homeless, millions of people on the brink of starvation, and everyone wanted to get back to some kind of normal life. Now you're going to present the world with this? Maybe not. On top of that, you have the whole nuclear issue, which was a very, very important thing. And by the way, in 1947, the United States still had a monopoly of functional atomic technology. It was a very big issue at the time. The United Nations was banging at the door of the United States saying this technology is so important, it needs to be under international control. The United States' answer was, sorry, no thank you. We're not going to share this with anybody. Now, if you're not going to want to share atomic technology with the world, I can guess you certainly would not want to share something as exotic as alien technology. Another issue is oil, obviously. Obviously. As I would say, a child looking at the performance or understanding the performance of these objects implicitly would know this is not gasoline. It's better. Whatever that source of energy that powers these things, it's not, and that's a problem. Because oil in the 1940s and 50s and beyond is still the foundation of the global infrastructure. Everything we do is built on oil. And by the way, in the 1940s, oil was boom, and the foundation for global economic growth of something like 5% a year every single year. And there seemed to be enough that would last forever. And maybe by 1950 production standards, it would have. Of course, this isn't 1950, and we're sucking it down pretty fast now. But oil was something that you wouldn't want to rock the boat. Not 1950. It gave us this. It gave us the entire infrastructure the automobile industry, and everything, the world of suburbs and all of that. So no, this is going to be too much, too much. Particularly with these objects now intruding, what you're going to want to do is study these objects, but you really don't want to tell the world just yet that this is real. Absolutely no. Of course, there's a couple of other reasons that you really want to keep a lid on this topic. Maybe the people in this room would be somewhat comfortable with the knowledge that this is a real phenomenon. Maybe many of us would handle it with some emotional sense of calmness and not panicking too much. But we all have family, we all have relatives, we have friends and neighbors. I think it's fair to say that many of those people may not handle it as well. There would be a certain amount of panic, a certain number of people who would be, well, it's an uncontrollable situation. And again, you have to know how to answer questions. Very interesting statement from the head of Project Blue Book in the 1950s, Edward Ruppelt, said to another researcher, he said, look, how could we convince the public the aliens were not hostile when we didn't know it ourselves? So again, you make an announcement early on when you know nothing, really, about what we're dealing with. How do you answer that question? Certainly people would want to know, and you wouldn't be able to answer it. So again, another reason for deep, deep secrecy on this topic, at least until you get a little more information. So the reaction to all of this is the creation of runaway secrecy. I've said this for years, and I'll say it again, that students of black budget America, and there are all too few of them, fail to appreciate the central importance of the UFO phenomenon in the creation of that infrastructure. And I'm not saying that UFOs are the only reason that we've had this sprawling, unwieldy, black budget structure that we now have, but I would say it was an important part of it. One of the things that this secrecy would have to mandate would be the classification of exotic technologies that were believed to be associated with these craft. One of the speakers at this conference is Tom Dolan, who worked in the U.S. Patent Office and has stated many times that he knew for a fact that many of the exotic technology patents were in fact classified. Breakaway energy type technologies and so forth. So what we end up having is a two-class society. Again, the very few who have access to this incredible technology, and the very many of us who do not. And I'm quite sure that centuries from now, when historians look back at our era, they're going to see that. They're going to see that there is this very, very small elite who were the in crowd, and the rest of us are not in with the in crowd. So in order to create the secrecy, you have to do a few things. All right, you have to create black budgets. What's a black budget? Well, basically, to put it simply, it's classified government spending that the government does not have to account for publicly. Now, as Catherine Austin Fitts, who's also here, and is one of my heroes, has pointed out, the real black budget involves a little bit more than just classified federal dollars. The real black budget certainly includes proceeds from such activities as narcotics trafficking, which is, let's say, one of the top few industries in the world. Just because it's illegal doesn't mean that no one wants the money. Everyone wants that money. Everyone wants that money, and particularly because it's unvouchered. You don't have to account for it. If you want to overthrow governments, raise secret armies, rig elections, kill people without anyone knowing, then it's nice to have your own private stash. Narco-trafficking can provide that. And of course, the other thing that she points out is financial fraud, banking fraud, and so forth. And all of these can go into what we would call black budget infrastructure. So there's that. Another thing you do is you create layers of secrecy. It's one thing to say that a program is secret, classified, but the way it really works is that secret programs are nested in other secret programs, which are in turn nested in yet other secret programs. There have been a few studies on this, and it really makes for better secrecy. So if a person who works for the Navy checks in, he then goes to a classified program. And then from there, he goes to a different classified program that's within that, and then another one. So if someone then says, oh my God, that guy's working on an ET-related technology program, no, that's the bottom layer. If you need to, you might give up the fact that, no, he's just working on, propulsion system for the B-2 stealth bomber or something like that. but within that would be nested other programs. So that's what I mean by layers of secrecy. Another thing you do to maintain secrecy, of course, is you control your media. It's not that hard. It's not as hard as you think. I grew up, probably maybe like most of you grew up thinking, oh yeah, well the media is our watchdog and they're there to inform us. Of course, I think many of us by now know a little bit better than that. We understand that media has a very close relationship with national security. There have been all too few, but a few studies that have highlighted this relationship. So what you have is, whether it's CIA or military intelligence, have their people in CBS or in ABC or Time or wherever. And they're there. And it's not that they control every single thing, but they can control spin. Back in 1977, the journalist Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame famously wrote an article for Rolling Stone magazine in which he talked about how the CIA had over 400 American journalists that had been on the CIA payroll. Pretty neat. Imagine what you could do if you had 400 American journalists covertly working for you. Could you control the entire media? Well, no. Could you influence it? Hell yes. Could you influence spin? Could you kill stories? Could you ridicule stories out of existence? Could you even create false stories if you needed to? Yes to all of those. And in fact, that's what did happen. In the aftermath of that, by the way, the CIA then said, well, no, in very lawyerly fashion, by the way, we don't have paid relationships with American journalists in that type of a manner. Well, no, in fact, they don't need to. Journalists jump over each other to have a relationship with CIA and the Pentagon. Of course they do. It's a career maker. Of course they do. So there's that level of control. And the same goes with academia and the world of science. And again, for those people who think, well, that's impossible, I would say think again. It's not that hard. What you do is you put your sheepdog in the system, and they corral the sheep. Back in the 1950s, one of those sheepdogs was Donald Menzel, astronomer at Harvard University. Menzel was the world's leading UFO debunker for years. And it didn't come out till much later, after his death, long after his death, that Menzel wasn't just an astronomer at Harvard of world standing. He was also a top cryptological expert with NSA. His own wife didn't even know. So, in other words, if some college professor at some small school got the UFO bug and wanted to write about it, well, there's Donald Menzel to smack him down. And who's going to mug Donald Menzel in the academic world? No one. Very few people would try. So that's really how it works. The academic culture, the scientific culture, they're almost self-reinforcing, particularly in science, which relies on grant money to do its work. And if the UFO topic and the technology associated with it is classified, guess what? There will be no funding coming from government sources to study it. So obviously, you're out of luck, and you instinctively know that it's a career killer anyway. So it's a self-enforcing system after a while. The culture of academia, the culture of science, reinforce that secrecy. And then ultimately what you need to do, since this is a classified subject, you have classified teams to study it. You have classified people with genius or brilliant IQs who study this technology, many of them being in private industry, in compartmented areas, whether at Lockheed or General Electric or Raytheon or wherever. And that's what they do. And that's what they study. What we have is a system of runaway secrecy. There have been all too few studies done about this. We need much, much more. We need much, much more. Two of them are here. One was a little over a decade ago by a fellow named Bill Sweetman, again, an aerospace aviation guy, who did a study of special access programs, that is, black budget programs. His conclusion then was that there's a lot of them. He vastly underestimated them, I think, but said that there's no oversight. And the interesting thing, I think, is that he said that they all appear to be privatized, that the dominant center of power of these special access programs really isn't from DoD personnel, rather from the private contractors themselves. And of course, that makes sense. It makes sense. When you look at our own government or governments around the world, what do you really see? You see private money, private industry behind them, of course. And the same conclusion was really reached about a decade later by Dana Priest and Bill Arkin in the Washington Post series. Very good series called Top Secret America. They really came to the same fundamental conclusion. Massive secrecy, runaway secrecy, basically out of control. And how do you get control over it? Well, they didn't know. I've talked a little bit about this from time to time. This is an idea that germinated in my head a couple of years ago. I call it a breakaway civilization. I'll just explain a little bit about this. I wasn't really going to get into this today, but why not? The way I think of a breakaway civilization is really an extreme version of what already we know exists within the classified world. This is not really a radical concept, although it's a neat idea, and I like the phrase. I'm glad I got that phrase. But essentially, let's imagine that some Roswell technology was recovered. Pretend it happened. I think it did. So you've got this technology and you're studying it. And you might have some very interesting ideas that come out of that. Perhaps improvements in transistors or integrated circuits or fiber optics or other neat things that you can make a lot of money off of. So these get segued into great investment opportunities. And of course, there goes your incentive ever for giving up this secret, by the way, because it becomes a goose that lays golden eggs. So that's one aspect of it. But what if you then discover in the classified research even better things than that? What if you discover that something like electrogravitics really does work? What if you discover an exotic form of energy harvesting? What would you do about that? Would you tell the world? Of course you would not. You wouldn't be allowed. Your bosses would say, continue to study it, but if we let that out, that takes down oil. There goes the oil industry. Not going to happen. Never going to happen if they have any say about it. So what happens is this is my own theory about it, but within the classified world then, how does science operate? Science works. One insight can lead to other insights, which leads to others still. And if the rest of the world is prevented due to classified patents, classified technology, from ever going past a certain level, then we are prevented from going here, but they are not. So if you make all of these breakthroughs, eventually, hey, you may come up with your own flying saucer after all. And if you do that, can you go off-world? Well, why not? And if you go off-world, might you have interactions with some of these, as I call them, others? Well, you might. With all of that, then you have a level of technology that's radically different from the rest of the world. You also have a cosmology, a conception of reality that's quite different. I think so much different that you might consider them a separate civilization, one that's broken away from our own, hence that term. And I think that's part of the picture also. So I think there's a group. They exist. One thing I really admire about Catherine Austin Fitz's work on this is that she tries to do a financial analysis of how this breakaway civilization might function. I think that's quite valuable. So again, back to our 5th grade civics class lesson, when we think who's in control, well, we think the president is. Our members of Congress are, and our Supreme Court, and our checks and balances, and hell, if we don't like who we elect, we'll throw the bums out and elect someone else. Well, I don't think that's how it works. I'm guessing you don't think that either. If the president isn't elected, but rather selected, then who does the selecting? Well, probably like this guy, David Rockefeller. And by the way, Rockefeller's two of his closest associates, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, have for years been the dominant voices in the formulation of national security strategy of the Republican and Democratic parties, respectively. Okay? And they both certainly were protégés of Rockefeller. So you have control over both of the parties. It's all about control, always has been, and it's absolutely the case now. You have a very small group of people who control major political parties in the US and elsewhere. And they plan your future. And they are all about planning your future. There's no free market. Not the way we grew up thinking that there is a free market in this country. And if you're an American, forget about upward mobility. It's pretty much a dream that's gone. What they're about is controlling us, controlling the population. I don't know if you want to call it a form of slavery or not, but it's a form of control. And if you think this is a new thing, I want to read this quotation to you from Woodrow Wilson from about 100 years ago when he was still president of Princeton University. Wilson said, "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult, manual tasks." And gee, I thought Wilson was a liberal. Maybe not so much. And actually, these types of statements they were run-of-the-mill for that era. I mean, really, a lot of in-your-face statements from other people, J.P. Morgan and a lot of others, said very much the same type of thing. And their attitude back then, and they didn't really care, they weren't worried about being politically correct. Many of them were social Darwinists. Many of them felt that this is progress. Let's not have a sentimental attitude about the people. And they just said, this is how it is. Today, these statements are couched in a little bit more politically respectable terms, but they are the same nevertheless. Now, what we have today in 2013 is a different situation. Things have changed. And I think they've changed. They may look bad, but I think they're changing in the favor of the people. Crazy as it sounds, I think that there are reasons that we can be hopeful. There's a war going on right now. It's the war about your freedom and your freedom from surveillance and your freedom to think as you please. And it's going on now. It will continue for the foreseeable future. It's about the structure of the New World Order. There is a New World Order. It's not going away. It's here. We're in a global village, so let's get used to it. But the real battle is over whether that New World Order will look a little bit like freedom or look like fascism. That's what the struggle's about. And that's what the fight is about. That's what we're here for. It's on the one hand a struggle between a hierarchical, financially oriented control system against something that I would say is more horizontal, something that deals with more shared resources, particularly intellectual resources, and is about freedom. I want to talk a little bit about that. One of the symptoms, or one of the results of this war, is what we're seeing here, whether it's WikiLeaks or groups like Anonymous or courageous journalists like Glenn Greenwald and others, people like Edward Snowden, who are all signs of what's happening here. We have a new infrastructure that allows for something like WikiLeaks to exist. 10 years ago, WikiLeaks, I would say, couldn't exist because we did not have a global infrastructure that would have allowed it to exist. But guess what? That infrastructure came into being, and almost as if by magic, boom, here's WikiLeaks and Anonymous and these other groups, because now they can exist. Because now we have the capability globally to share information digitally with each other everywhere. And so now you have this. So there's a fight against the system, this entrenched system of control and power. That's the fight. Where will that fight end up? We'll come back to it. Let's shift gears a little bit now. We have a world that we can all agree is in crisis, certainly in terms of energy. Let's look at that. You know, people, we talk about free energy, but actually there was once a free energy. It was called oil. Back in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, oil was a new thing. And oil generated a lot more BTUs than old biofuels did, than wood, for sure, even than coal. Oil was revolutionary, and it was cheap. You go to Spindletop, Texas in 1903 and stick your finger in the ground, and you get a big gusher. Good quality, light, crude, sweet crude oil. And it was great. It was easily transportable, and a really nice thing about oil is that you could monetize it. You can make a lot of money off of oil if you control that supply. So it was very attractive, and it allowed us to create, well, the world that we have in all of its tawdry, splendid glory. Of course, oil and natural gas, and those are dangerous to the environment. We all know this. And ultimately, I guess we could say they're finite. I know there's a school of thought that says oil is an ultimately renewable resource, and maybe that's true. I don't really know. I don't think it is quite, but maybe it is. But I would say that's irrelevant because what you see are oil fields that are still showing definite signs of depletion. And if that oil is ultimately renewable, I don't think we have the easiest way of getting to it. So it's, you know, there's that old parable of the emperor of China. And a peasant does a favor for the emperor. And the emperor says, well, thank you. That was really nice of you. I'll give you any one thing you ask for. And the peasant says, well, that's cool. So here's a chessboard, and I'm going to put a grain of rice here, and we're going to double it for each square. And all I would like is for you to fill the board with rice. The emperor thinks at first, stupid peasant, I'd have given you something nice. But I think you can see where this goes. So the power of doubling, at first it's not a big deal. But by the time you get to the end of the chessboard, it's more rice than has ever been grown in the history of civilization. That's the power of doubling. And what we are dealing with is, well, exponential increase of energy consumption. All right? Which has a relationship to economic growth. In other words, historically, what we know is that when you have cheap and abundant energy, you will have economic growth. If you do not have cheap and abundant energy, you will not have economic growth. And so if we have a demand, and to have greater and greater use of energy, we require a greater and greater use of energy for continued economic growth. If our use of energy goes down, we're going to have some serious economic problems, the way that our system at least is currently configured. That's a problem. That's a real problem. So now we're looking at alternative sources of energy, we find, right? We've got conventional alternative sources, solar, wind, and geothermal, and as the Obama administration would like to convince you, hydrofracking. Yeah, that's an alternative source of energy, they say. ExxonMobil certainly says this. And by the way, well, I'm going to come back to fracking in just a minute, so let me just hold off. And then, in addition to the conventional sources, you've got the exotic, which is really what this conference is about. Whether it's cold fusion or over-unity devices like electromagnetic motors, magnet motors, gravity, and so on. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of brilliant people in this world coming up with very interesting ideas about over-unity and other just unusually efficient energy sources. So they're out there, and they get relegated to the fringe and get laughed at. Remember in Lord of the Rings where Galadriel says, your quest is at the edge of a knife. We are at the edge of a knife. And I would say that because right now, the initiative for hydraulic fracking has taken over the energy industry. It's taken over. And for every dollar invested in solar and geothermal and wind and anything else that you can think of, multiple times that amount are being invested by the majors in fracking. All right? And they are saying, oh, this is an alternative source and is allowing us the U.S. to claim to get energy independence, and it's a good thing, and there's jobs, and all these wonderful things. And it does produce a fair amount of natural gas, the estimate of 300,000 barrels of natural gas per day. Okay, that's pretty good, you think, right? Not really. It's created a fracking mess. Remember in, was it Battlestar Galactica, they used that word a lot, didn't they? Yeah, that's pretty cool. So I think we all kind of, many of us, and probably many of you listening know this very well, but there are people watching and streaming and who will be watching on YouTube who may not really know all of the details of what fracking actually does. And I just want to explain that a little bit here. What fracking does is it means drilling and injecting fluid deep into the ground at very high pressure. All right, and the idea is to fracture the shale, layers of shale that are way below, and to release natural gas deposits that are there. Now, what you may not have known is that most typical gas wells require an average of about 400 tanker trucks to carry the water and the supplies to and from the site. Up to 600 chemicals are also used, and they're mixed in with the water. And some of these chemicals are really bad: lead, uranium, mercury, radium, methanol, hydrochloric acid, formaldehyde, and many others. Nasty chemicals. And they also, along with the water, get injected at high pressure into the ground through this drilled pipeline. And what happens then is that it causes the shale to crack, fracture, which creates fissures, and that releases the natural gas into the well, so you can capture it. Of course, a lot of that gas is not captured anyway. A lot of it is not. Well, the methane and the other nasty chemicals do leach into groundwater. We know this is the case. Methane concentrations are extremely high in areas of fracking. They get into your drinking water, and they will mess you up. They cause a lot of sickness and illness, many documented cases of this. And by the way, I learned just recently that a lot of the fracking is not even to recover natural gas. A lot of the fracking results in just burning off that natural gas. And you think, well, why? Excuse me, how much time do I have left? Are you kidding me? Have I been going for that long? Wow, okay, we're going to be fine. So anyway, it's all... And then after this, we're invading the other panel. Remember that. So we're going to go together. The point is, a lot of this is wasted. They burn off the natural gas to get at the oil below, and it's just all wasted energy. It's horrible, horrible. So there's an urgency here that we all have to get something better online. I think it's actually possible. Now, new energy devices, you have skeptics saying, well, you're breaking the law of conservation of energy. You can't create energy. It can only be change form, but it can't be created or destroyed. You know what? That doesn't stop people around the world from developing over Unity devices. There's a website, let me just go back, from Pure Energy Systems Wiki. I want to give them credit, pestwiki.com. Really neat site. And they just describe a number of developments, devices that they think are very intriguing, and I'm only quickly going to go over this because I want to get to the end here. A variety, dozens of over Unity motor generators. And the idea is that you have, after the initial spark to start it up, you have a motor that turns a larger generator, which powers the motor and produces excess energy. How does it happen? I don't know. But there are a number of people who say they've gotten this thing to work. That involves magnetism. It involves somehow geometry of the system itself, which allows the current and voltage to phase or go out of phase in a certain way that it creates energy, and in fact, over Unity energy. That's the claim. Is it true? I don't know if it's true. It's interesting. That's one possibility. There's a cold fusion energy catalyzer, which was developed at the University of Bologna. Demonstration was given in 2011. Very interesting. And they're beginning commercial sales of a 1 megawatt plant. Will this work? Well, the scientists say it's impossible, but these people are building it. And they've got investors. There's a lot of interest. The Defcalian, low energy nuclear reactor, basically cold fusion. This is just recently a demonstration that was given this summer. Some glitches in the demonstration. They didn't quite get it right, but it looks promising. It looks very promising, and it looks like it could be over Unity as well. That is, getting more energy out than what you put into it. Something going on. The Irish company Storn, they kind of had a real debacle 7 years ago, when they said they had a device, technology that would provide clean, free energy, constant energy. Demonstration didn't work. They said, it's a publicity stunt. They're still going, and they're still developing what appear to be very interesting energy devices. Whether or not they're over Unity, I don't know, but they seem to be highly efficient. And the last of these that I'll just mention, the EMAG magnetic propulsion engine. This is developed in Spain. Again, a lot of research going on in Europe. I think it's quite interesting. And they also claim that it provides continuous electricity 24/7. They say it's getting ready for the market. Are any of these ready? Are they valid? I don't know. But I want to talk about 3D printing because I think this is actually the core. This is possibly the thing that will, I hate to be over-the-top enthusiastic, but I am over-the-top enthusiastic about the potentiality of 3D printing in our world. This has the potential to break the stranglehold of this hierarchical control system that we're all dealing with. 3D printing basically means you put up a 3D CAD design of something, all right, of a device. Right now they do a lot of coffee cups because we're just at that early stage. And an extruder, a device will extrude plastic. And layer by layer will recreate exactly your design. Now, right now we're at a very early stage of it, but we're looking to be doing 3D printing of biological materials. And this is, I just read this article 2-3 days ago out of Wired. This is incredible stuff. You have scientists at the University of Texas who have made 3D printed with a laser type of technology at the microscopic level, a cage, a donut-shaped cage to hold bacteria. Pretty nifty. This stuff is moving fast. All right, so the future of 3D printing essentially involves not just plastic. Japan right now, they're doing 3D printing of metal. And in the next few years, we're going to be talking about 3D printing of mixed materials, including integrated circuits and electronics. It's going to happen. 3D printing of organic materials, including food, if you can believe it. All right? But using 3D scanners, you would be able to scan exactly and reproduce. This is like Star Trek's replicator. As crazy as it sounds, it's happening. It is happening. So now, let me put an idea here into your head. All right? Do you think some smart fellow or a smart lady somewhere in the world is going to come up with a 3D device that will be over Unity? They'll put up a 3D design of an over Unity device. Yeah, I think so. Hell yes, I think so. Are they all going to work? Probably not. Will some of them work? Hey, let's find out. What we're looking at, this is like the Pirate Bay marries the world of manufacturing. I mean, really. All right, remember with Napster, people file sharing and downloading music, and they weren't supposed to do it, and Metallica got really pissed off. But guess what? You can't stop it. You can't stop it. It's happening. It's happening everywhere. So what's going to happen, I guarantee this. Some smart person on their own is going to come up with something that's probably classified right now. So do you think they're not going to upload it for that reason? No, I think they will certainly upload it. And they may not even care about getting profit off of it. They don't give a shit. They'll just upload it. And then you and other people will download it. And you're going to make it. Now, I don't know when this will happen. Maybe not before 5 years because our technology, we're just kind of coming up to it. But it's going to happen. As sure as anything else will happen. So there's going to be a big fight over this. You're going to have people saying, oh, well, you're stealing intellectual property rights. Well, yes, maybe. I don't know. Does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's going to happen. And if they make it illegal in America, they're still going to be doing it in other countries, and it's just going to spread. Right now, they're trying to scare you by saying, oh, yeah, your neighbors can 3D print a gun. Do you want that to happen? That's pure scare tactics. Don't buy into it. Of course, there's dangers. There's always dangers. It's the world. But there's an opportunity here that is off the charts. The opportunity is that there will be a true free market of innovation, a true free market of selling. Whether it's black market or not, again, is irrelevant. It's going to happen. It's going to break this system that's in place, a hierarchical control system. Well, does that mean that the answer to the energy is cold fusion or in some electromagnetic system? I don't know. That's not really my expertise. Maybe that's yours, not mine. It doesn't matter. The point is that something's going to do it. All right? So there's going to be a lot of conflict over this, a lot of fighting, but you can't stop. You know, it's like trying to stop the tide from coming in. There's that story of the emperor goes out to the beach. I command you to not come in, tide. Well, the tide's going to come in anyway. That's our world. Now, there's a lot of tremendous opportunity here. Let's not shortchange it. And actually, I will be done on time. This is incredible. This is a first for me. All right? I just want you to understand, I have never done this before. And it's only 60 minutes, which is short for me. The opportunity is that we do have a possible era of true abundance. And that could mean peace. There's a very good argument to be made that the wars that we're dealing with are based on scarcity. Lack of water, lack of other resources, right? And that if you give people what they need, which is sufficient energy, which is the bottom line for all of us, then you might have a world of happy people that don't have an incentive to start blowing each other up. That's a possibility. There's another possibility that I think is very attractive, which is environmental remediation. There are a lot of technologies on board right now that actually could do a very good job at remediation of toxic spills and toxins in our environment and so forth. One of the biggest technical hurdles we have is simply having enough energy to do it. But that might be overcome now. So there's some incredible potentials here. And we don't want to lose sight of them. There are also threats. I say that I'm an idealist, but I'm not a utopian. And I'm not a utopian. We have to look at this with a cold eye, with an objective eye. The world of 3D printing combined with some other developments like advanced computing, perhaps even approaching the singularity, perhaps advances in nanotech. Who knows what the capability will be to create newer and better weapons. If you have access to zero-point energy, let's say that there's a tremendous amount of energy that's available there. Many people say there is. So if you have access to that, could you blow up the Atlantic Ocean? You know, maybe you won't. But there are always assholes in this world. So there are going to be people who will try to do it. Until we all shed this mortal coil and ascend into a higher density or whatever, we're going to be human beings, and we're not all going to be trusted, and so that's a concern. And I'm not trying to be a fearmonger, but that's a concern. And, you know, just the idea of giving humans a little more energy, or a lot more energy, is not always the thing that I think is the best idea. I mean, we got a lot more energy with oil, and it allowed us to crawl over the earth like termites, gobbling everything up. Not just polluting, but just like eating all the fish in the ocean and all the other things that we do. So we have to be careful to think that, oh yeah, more energy will solve all of our problems. I think we have to be mindful of the other sides of this. And then, just a practical problem will be the confrontation that people will have with the hierarchical system that's in place, whether it's the breakaway civilization, black budget world, the financial elites, whatever they are. They are not going to take this lying down. They're going to fight. This is for their own survival. So will that result in a global fascist state that is imposed? Again, I don't know. But these are things that I think about. So all of these are issues. And we have to be grown up here and realize that it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of tenacity for us to toe the line and do the right thing and navigate our way through this. And again, I don't have every answer. I'm just about done. We're going to finish this on time. Are we on time? Okay. The last thought I want to leave you with here is that this energy, this breakthrough energy that we're all here concerned with, is one, not the only. It's one of many pivotal issues that we're facing right now in this generation, in this time. All right? I think what we're going to see is a perfect storm develop. That is, a multitude of issues are going to come to a head. One of them will be energy. One of them will be exposure of cover-ups and crimes. One of them will be the UFO phenomenon, which I wrote about at length in one book called AD After Disclosure, where I really try to envision a world in which the UFO cover-up does end. How might it end, I ask? And what after that? How would it change, transform, rock our world? The answer that I came to, I co-wrote this book, was that it will utterly transform our world in ways that I think it's almost difficult for us to imagine, and I tried. But scientifically, in terms of culture, in terms of politics, geopolitics, spirituality, everything, it's transformative. And I think that's on the way. And then, of course, things coming to a head in terms of advanced computing and perhaps the advent of what we might call the singularity. I think that is a real possibility. All of this is happening within the next generation. Most of us are going to be here to see it. It's going to be a very, very wild ride. It may not always be a pleasant ride, but we're going to be here, and it's our obligation. It's our obligation to go through it with as much integrity and bravery as we can muster. It may not be easy, but I think we can do it. I would encourage you to visit my website. It's richarddolanpress.com. These are some of my books. I have a new book coming out. By the way, these other books are here. You can peruse them on the tables outside. The new book I have is called UFOs of the 21st Century Mind, and it's a new overview of the entire topic of UFOs. I'm very excited about this book. I think it covers the field in all of its incredible mystery and maddening glory. That'll be out in a month or two. So for that, I want to thank you for your time. I think it's been a lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you so very much. And I think, hey, I love seeing people stand up. That's great. So we're going to go to tent number 1, and we're going to go visit the panel, okay?
Breakthrough Energy Movement brings you the very well-known Mr. Richard Dolan.
Thank you. Thanks so very much. What a pleasure to be here. I am the token UFO researcher for the Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference. They had to bring in one guy. They got me. I understood that it was a slightly controversial decision to bring in a researcher of UFO phenomenon just for something like this, which I understand. The breakthrough energy is fringe enough, let us say frontier enough. so that, they have their work cut out for them as it is, politically, getting respectability and so forth. So the last thing they need is to bring someone like the UFO people in. That's like having a Christian evangelical person to want to talk to you about Jesus. That's about as popular as that. Who wouldn't love to talk to Jesus or about Jesus in a random conversation? So they bring in the UFO people. But actually, I will explain to you that I think the UFO phenomenon is actually quite relevant for breakthrough energy. And I actually decided to redo part of this talk for you for a couple of reasons. One is that it's only going to be 60 minutes, not 90 or 2 hours or 3 hours, which is what I was originally planning to do. And the reason for that is at the end of this, I'm going to be joining a panel, which will be starting around now, but I'll join it at 8 o'clock. And all of you will be invited to, we can all kind of go in together and interrupt the entire panel so that we can make our presence known. That's one thing we'll do. The other reason I redid my talk tonight is simply because I wasn't really planning to do a whole lot of UFO discussion. I had a lot planned to talk about regarding energy, which is, I certainly would never pretend that I'm anything more than a novice compared with many of the other presenters here. I don't have the scientific background to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of cold fusion arguments and so forth, but it's interesting to me, and I do have my own take on it, and I will be sharing that with you. But then I was told that a lot of people wanted to hear a little bit about why UFOs were relevant, so I thought, well, I'll do that as well. So there's a lot of different things here, and I had to really think hard about how to string all of these various thoughts together into something coherent and something new and or natural phenomenon or what have you, but not real things. Twining is saying otherwise. He described some of their performance, which again is off the charts, really great. Extreme rates of climb and maneuverability, evasive action, metallic light reflecting surface, absence of trail, and my favorite, circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom, and domed on top. I'd like to know what in 1947 would look like that. No sound, and so forth. Very interesting memo. An FBI memo just from a couple of years later, which again emphasizes that this is a serious thing here. That the matter is considered top secret by intelligence officers of the U.S. military, and then describing a large number of violations of very sensitive airspace by objects, again, that just were not supposed to exist over nuclear installations and sensitive Air Force and military installations. It's a very long memo. It's very interesting to read. Another memo from 1950 describing, yet again, more violations of airspace by objects, in this case, round in form, being seen over the Hanford Atomic Energy Commission plant. This is fascinating. Air Force jets attempted interception with negative results. All units, including the anti-aircraft battalion, radar units, Air Force fighter squadrons, and the FBI were alerted for further observation. The Atomic Energy Commission states that the investigation is continuing. Of course, we have no record of what they concluded and how that investigation did continue. But again, this is quite interesting. Can you imagine if in 1950 President Truman had admitted that, well, yes, in fact, there's this thing going on over Hanford, and we've tried sending our Air Force squadron fighters after them, and, well, we haven't succeeded, but don't worry, we're working on the problem. It'd be a very difficult thing to deal with. But all in the classified world, see, they were having these conversations. Another fascinating encounter, again showing extraordinary performance. This is in Georgia, near an Air Force base. A pilot, a very experienced World War II pilot, had an encounter in the air which he described. An object, he says, flat on top and bottom, appearing from a front view to be rounded and slightly beveled. The object from the front dived at him below his aircraft. And as it dove in front of him, it was spinning, he said. Pure white, no trail, tremendous speed. And here's this really fascinating part. He described he felt a bump in the plane when it went underneath him. So maybe the air pressure just hit his plane in a certain way. Highly reliable pilot. 11, if I'm not mistaken. And officially, of course, well, we don't have anything supposedly like that. but I think maybe we do. The idea of an invisibility suit, this is actually not science fiction. It involves bending light around, the object in question. Typically, we thought that it could work for small objects, but I think the U.S. military may have mastered something even a little bit better than that. You'll notice that the figure was much more difficult to see in the kind of natural area over there, and was more visible as he approached the tank. So evidently it was a camouflage type of a suit that worked for a certain type of environment. Again, just to show that there is a great divide. And the great divide is between the classified world and us. They have things that we don't have, and we might wonder what else do they have, and I want to talk about that. This is how we're going to take our little segue into UFOs. UFO phenomenon, contrary to what most of us schooled in the conventional wisdom of our world, is actually one of the absolutely most fascinating and also relevant topics in our world today. Why? Because when you really study this, you find that it affects pretty much every single factor of importance in our world today. It certainly has a tremendous amount of influence and importance in the world of energy, technology, our black budget world, which has taken over much of our formal system, our old-fashioned republic, sort of like a new type of clothing or armor that's gone around it and has really become the dominant modality in many ways. And UFO phenomenon is important for social and I would say existential implications. I think we can get into all of those and then come back into breakthrough energy, which is really going to be the main topic of my talk here. But let's talk about a little bit about UFO and UFO secrecy. If you go back 60 years and pretend that you're Harry Truman and you've been presented with some information, and that information has to do with the fact that this phenomenon seems to be real. There are others, there's other technology, other beings perhaps, that are interacting with us in our world. Maybe something that we recovered at Roswell or another crash retrieval site involving exotic technology. You think it may not be true? Well, let's think again. On top of that, the president would have been informed or would have learned that we've had essentially what I would say are non-stop military encounters with objects that are unconventional, that don't look like anything that we've created, and that have incredible performance characteristics. And not just militaries, and not just the United States military, but other militaries around the world. And of course, non-stop sightings by ordinary people around the world. On top of that, I'm getting ahead of myself. I would recommend, if you are interested in following up on this, I wrote an article a few years ago that I still think is quite useful, particularly for people who really know nothing about the UFO phenomenon and think, well, what's the evidence? Well, there's a lot of interesting government documents, I'll talk a little bit about these, that do take UFOs quite seriously. I would say individually, the officially released documents that we've gotten through Freedom of Information don't prove that UFOs are alien or ET. I would say that collectively they make a very strong case that what we are dealing with is not supposed to exist, but yet it does. And that high-level government officials have been taking it seriously since the very beginning. You can read that article at my website, richarddolanpress.com. One of the documents, and this is not one that I wrote about in that article, but nonetheless is quite significant, interesting. It's interesting because it shows performance characteristics that are amazing. This is from Guam, 1947. I'll just read the relevant part to you. It's an Army intelligence document. Flying objects in Guam. Unidentified flying objects have been observed by 3 American enlisted men of the 147th Airway and Air Communication Service Squadron at Harmon Field in Guam. The men report that at 10:40 hours, that's in the morning, on August 14th, the 2 objects, which they describe as small, crescent-shaped and traveling at a speed twice that of a fighter plane, passed over them on a zigzag course in a westerly direction at an approximate altitude of 1,200 feet, not that high up at all. The objects disappeared into clouds. And a few seconds later, a similar object, possibly one of these previously observed, emerged from the clouds and proceeded west. No further details have been reported. Very interesting. Very fast, zigzagging. What can zigzag? We have a much better known memo, at least among researchers of UFO, called the Twining Memo. Nathan Twining was a 3-star general at the time. He later became a 4-star general and head of U.S. Air Force. And in response to a query by another general in September of 1947, who wanted to know what is the significance of these flying saucers, is this anything that we have to deal with, Twining wrote back a 3-page memo. It was secret at the time. And he says these objects are real, they are not visionary or fictitious. Interesting, particularly since in 1947, the official word was that these were hallucinations or fresh. And I hope that I've done all of that for you, so we'll get started. The first thing I want to do is just bring up the fact that we have a U.S. government shutdown going right now. And that means that the government is shut down for some things, but certainly not for other things. It's certainly not shut down for DARPA, which has its own source of funding. I'm sure some of it subterranean black budget type funding. DARPA representatives have said very diplomatically, we have our other sources that are independent of formal U.S. government funds, and I'm sure they do. I'm sure DARPA does. One of the things that the government shutdown will not affect is DARPA research into creating a Terminator type of scenario, just like a friendly Terminator kind of thing to make our lives much more pleasant. I want to show you a couple of the things that they're working on, and there's a reason I want to do this. This is a clip of something that they call the cheetah. And if you can see this,